The cafe went quiet the moment the cashier said it. "I'm sorry, sir. Your card was declined." The old soldier stood there holding a small paper cup of coffee. His jacket was worn at the elbows, and the faded cap on his head carried the insignia of a unit. I recognized instantly. A few people in line behind him sighed impatiently. Someone muttered, "Come on." The cashier tried again. Same result. Declined. The old man nodded once, slowly reaching into his pocket like he was hoping to find another card that probably wasn't there. Have you ever watched someone try to keep their dignity while the room quietly judges them? I stepped forward. "Add it to mine," I told the cashier. The total was less than $10. I paid, picked up my own coffee, and walked out before the man could even turn around. I never asked his name. I didn't think I'd ever see him again. 3 weeks later, my commanding officer called me into his office, and the man sitting in the chair across from him was wearing 4 stars. The cafe sat just off a quiet highway outside Norfolk. It wasn't the kind of place people talked about. No polished floors, no trendy menus, just a small building with foggy windows, a faded sign, and the steady smell of burnt coffee that seemed to live permanently in the air. I stopped there sometimes after morning training. That morning had started like any other. Cold wind coming off the water, the sky still gray from early winter clouds. My uniform jacket zipped halfway as I stepped inside the cafe to warm up before heading back to base. The bell above the door jingled softly when I walked in. Inside, the room felt calm. A couple of truck drivers sat near the window. A woman typed quietly on a laptop in the corner. The radio behind the counter played an old country song barely loud enough to hear. And at the register stood the old soldier. I noticed him right away. Not because he was causing a scene. Quite the opposite. He stood perfectly still while the cashier tried to run his card again. "I'm sorry, sir," the young cashier said, clearly uncomfortable. "It's declining." The old man nodded once. "Try it again," he said quietly. His voice was steady. Not embarrassed, not angry. Just patient. Have you ever seen someone handle an uncomfortable moment with so much dignity that it makes the rest of the room feel awkward? The second attempt failed too. The machine beeped. Declined. Someone in line behind him shifted impatiently. Another person sighed. The old soldier reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. He opened it carefully, checking inside like he already knew what he would find. Not much. The man's jacket sleeve lifted slightly as he moved. That's when I noticed the tattoo. Old military ink. The kind that only came from certain units. The kind you don't see very often anymore. He finally closed the wallet and gave a small nod. "I'll just take the coffee," he said. But even that wasn't enough. The cashier looked down at the screen. "Sir, even the coffee didn't go through." For the first time, the room felt uncomfortable. Not because of him. Because of everyone else watching. That's when I stepped forward. "Put it on mine," I said. The cashier blinked. "You sure?" "It's fine." The old soldier turned slightly, like he had just realized someone else was involved now. But before he could say anything, the receipt was already printing. $9 and change. That was it. He started to say something as I grabbed my coffee. But I was already heading for the door. Because sometimes the best way to help someone keep their dignity is to leave before they have to thank you. The cold air hit my face the moment I stepped outside the cafe. For a second, I just stood there with my coffee, watching the morning traffic move slowly along the highway. Trucks rolled past. A dog barked somewhere across the street. Inside the cafe, life was probably already moving on. Orders being called, chairs scraping against the floor, The kind of quiet routine that makes small moments disappear quickly. Have you ever done something simple for someone and then immediately forgotten about it? That's exactly what happened. By the time I reached the base gates 10 minutes later, the entire situation had already slipped out of my mind. Military life has a way of doing that. Days blur together, training schedules, briefings, paperwork, endless routines that leave very little room to dwell on small interactions with strangers. The next 3 weeks passed quickly. Morning drills, long afternoons in the operations building, cold December winds coming in from the water. Nothing unusual happened until the morning my commanding officer called me in. I had just finished a routine equipment check when the message came through. Lieutenant Harris wants to see you. That wasn't unusual, but the tone of the sergeant who delivered the message felt strange. Not serious, not urgent, just curious. Have you ever walked toward a meeting with a superior officer and felt like you had missed something important? That was exactly how it felt. I replayed the past few weeks in my head while walking down the hallway toward the office. Had I messed up a report? Missed a deadline? Said something wrong during a briefing? Nothing came to mind. When I reached the door, I knocked twice. "Come in," the lieutenant's voice said. I opened the door and immediately noticed someone else sitting in the chair across from his desk. An older man, a back straight, hands resting calmly on his knees. At first I only noticed the uniform, dark blue, perfectly pressed. Then I saw the insignia on the shoulders, 4 stars. For a second my brain refused to process it, because the man sitting in that chair looked very familiar. For a moment I just stood there. My hand was still on the office door. My mind was trying to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. The 4 silver stars on his shoulders were impossible to ignore. Even someone brand new to the military would recognize them. But it wasn't the rank that stopped me. It was his face. Because 3 weeks earlier, that same man had been standing in a small café holding a declined credit card and a paper cup of coffee. Have you ever had a moment where your brain instantly rewinds time, trying to confirm what you're seeing? The worn jacket was gone. The faded cap, too. Now he wore a perfectly pressed uniform that carried decades of service on it. Rows of ribbons lined his chest, each one representing years of history most people could only read about. My commanding officer stood when I entered. "At ease," he said calmly. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The general watched me quietly for a moment. Not intimidating. Not cold. Just observant. Like he was studying a small detail that interested him. Finally, he spoke. "You stopped at a café outside Norfolk about 3 weeks ago," he said. His voice was calm. Bolder but steady. My heart skipped once. So he remembered. "Yes, sir," I replied. He nodded slowly. "You paid for an old soldier's breakfast." I shifted slightly. "Yes, sir." The room fell silent again. Have you ever felt like you were being evaluated without knowing exactly why? The general leaned back slightly in his chair. "Do you remember what that breakfast cost?" The question caught me off guard. "No, sir." $9.30, he said. He said it like it mattered. Like that small number had weight behind it. My commanding officer glanced between us but said nothing. The general continued watching me for another quiet second. Then he asked something unexpected. "Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air longer than I expected. "Why did you do it?" $9.30. That was what the general had said the breakfast cost. I stood there for a moment trying to decide if there was a right answer. Military meetings sometimes feel like tests you didn't know you were taking. Finally, I spoke. "Honestly, sir, it didn't feel like a big decision." The general didn't interrupt. You saw someone who needed help, he said. Yes, sir. I hesitated for a second before continuing. I've seen enough soldiers struggle after service. Sometimes it's small things. Pride gets in the way of asking for help. The general nodded slightly. But you didn't stay to let him thank you. No, sir. Why? That part was easier to explain. Because if someone's already in an uncomfortable situation, drawing attention to it usually makes it worse. The room stayed quiet. Have you ever answered a question honestly and suddenly wondered if you said too much? The general looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he gave a small, almost amused smile. That's interesting. My commanding officer shifted slightly in his chair, clearly curious where this conversation was going. The general leaned forward slightly. You recognized the unit tattoo on his arm, didn't you? Yes, sir. Which one? I named the unit. A very old one. One that most younger soldiers would only recognize from history briefings. The general's smile widened slightly. I thought so. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. That tattoo belonged to my brother. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. He continued calmly. He passed away 10 years ago. The room felt heavier suddenly. He used to say something about soldiers, the general added quietly. Good ones notice things others ignore. He looked up again. And 3 weeks ago you noticed. I wasn't sure what to say. It had been such a small moment. But the general seemed to see it differently. He leaned back in his chair again, studying me carefully. And then he asked a question I definitely hadn't expected. Have you ever thought about what kind of officer you want to become? The question caught me completely off guard. What kind of officer do you want to become? For a moment, I just stood there thinking about it. Most people would probably answer something polished in a situation like that. Leadership, honor, service, the kinds of words that sound good in reports and speeches. But the general's expression told me he wasn't looking for something rehearsed. So I answered, honestly, I want to be the kind of officer people don't have to be afraid of. The room stayed quiet. My commanding officer looked slightly surprised by the answer, but the general didn't react right away. He simply studied my face like he was measuring the words. Explain, he said. I took a slow breath. I've seen a lot of leaders who rely on authority instead of respect, I said. People follow orders, but they don't trust them. The general nodded slightly. And you think trust matters more? Yes, sir. I paused before adding something else. My father used to say something when I was younger. The general leaned forward a little. What was that? He said real leadership shows up in small moments. I could still hear the words clearly. He used to say if you want to know someone's character, watch what they do when nobody important is watching. The general's eyes didn't leave mine. And suddenly the room felt a little smaller. Have you ever shared something personal and realized the person listening understands more than you expected? The general nodded slowly. That's a good lesson. Then he glanced briefly toward my commanding officer before looking back at me. Do you know why I asked you that question today? No, sir. He folded his hands calmly. Because the military can teach discipline, strategy, and procedure. He paused. But character? That shows up long before someone earns rank. Then he leaned forward slightly and said something I would remember for the rest of my career. And sometimes it reveals itself over a $9 breakfast. The room stayed quiet after he said that. $9.30. It still felt strange hearing that number repeated like it meant something important. To me, it had just been a quick decision in a small café. But the general seemed to see it differently. He leaned back in his chair again, his expression thoughtful. Do you know why I was in that café that morning? He asked. No, sir. I was visiting an old training site nearby, he said. I like to stop at places where soldiers pass through. It reminds me where most careers actually start. He paused for a moment. Not in offices like this. In small, ordinary places. Have you ever realized that someone much more experienced than you is quietly measuring how you think? The general nodded once more. Most people in that room noticed the situation, he said. But they pretended not to. His eyes met mine again. You didn't? I didn't know how to respond to that. He continued calmly. Kindness isn't something we put in evaluation reports, he said, but it tells you more about a person than any performance review. Then he stood. My commanding officer stood with him. The meeting clearly wasn't about discipline or correction. It had been something else entirely. As the general walked toward the door, he paused beside me. Keep noticing things, he said quietly. Good officers do. Then he left the room. And suddenly the entire conversation made a lot more sense. After the general left the office, the room felt strangely quiet. My commanding officer sat back down slowly, watching the door for a moment before looking at me. Well, he said with a small smile, that's not the kind of meeting we usually have around here. I nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. You know, he said, I've been in the military a long time. I've seen plenty of impressive resumes, decorated uniforms, and perfectly written reports. He paused. But moments like that? They're rare. Have you ever realized that something you barely thought about ended up meaning more than you expected? I left the office a few minutes later and stepped out into the cold afternoon air. The base looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Soldiers walking between buildings. Vehicles moving across the lot. Routine continuing like nothing unusual had happened. But something felt different to me. Because that small moment in a café had quietly turned into a reminder I wouldn't forget. Sometimes leadership isn't about rank. Sometimes it isn't about recognition either. Sometimes it's about noticing when someone needs help and choosing to act before anyone else does. Weeks later, I passed that same café again on the highway. The sign still flickered slightly above the door. For a moment, I considered stopping. Then I smiled and kept driving. Because the truth was, the lesson from that morning had nothing to do with who that old soldier turned out to be. It had everything to do with the simple choice made when nobody important seemed to be watching. And sometimes, those are the moments that matter the most. What would you have done in that moment? Comment below.